The content of this podcast is based on medical fact and evidence-based practice from credible authoritative sources, but is not a substitute for your institution's policies, procedures, common sense, or good judgment. The views and opinions are those of Eric Bauer and FlightBridgeED in their entirety. This is the FlightBridgeED Podcast, critical care and emergency medicine education for nurses and paramedics. Here's your host, Eric Bauer.
Hey everybody, Eric back with you. Today I want to do a quick podcast, probably about 10 minutes, and I want to focus on a new mode of ventilation that we see with the Hamilton T1 called ASV, or what's called adaptive support ventilation. Came across a study and thought the study was pretty cool. It was published in the Critical Care Medicine Focus on Anesthesia, May 2011, Volume 114, Issue 5, and it's pages 1138 through 1143, and I will post this in the show notes under the podcast on the website. One of the things that I have done and been privileged to do is I've got to collaborate with a lot of people, and I've got to collaborate with people from Care Fusion and respiratory therapists and their ability to kind of explain the concepts of the different ventilators. Got to do the same thing with the great respiratory therapists at Hamilton and their great ventilator, Hamilton T1. And I think the ventilator is phenomenal. I think the things that it does, the information it gives you is excellent. There's one little thing though that I just can't get by, and that is this mode of ventilation, adaptive support ventilation. And here's the thing, and I've conveyed this to the reps, to the respiratory therapists. I've conveyed this. I haven't hidden this concern, but my concern is that a lot of times it's marketed. The ventilator is marketed to folks, agencies, fire departments, and it's marketed based on that mode of ventilation. And it's marketed as turn the ventilator on, put the patient in adaptive support ventilation, or ASV, and let the ventilator take care of itself. Because essentially what happens is the adaptive support ventilation, it drives everything. It changes the pressure. It regulates everything based on you essentially setting a ideal body weight. You set a height in there, it identifies ideal body weight for that patient, male or female, and then it sets a target minute ventilation. And then based on what it identifies with pressures and different aspects based on its algorithms, it will adjust either the tidal volume or the respiratory rate based on what it's seeing. And so there's some concerns that I have with that. And the concerns are, what happens if the ventilator kind of identifies that you have a patient with poor compliance versus somebody with good compliance? It basically, the algorithm states it's never going to sacrifice minute ventilation. It's always going to, give them that target minute ventilation. So this study kind of represents exactly my concerns. I want you to just kind of hear what I have to say. I think that at the end, I'll kind of give you my conclusions. I've talked to different colleagues that use the Hamilton T1 that are very adverse in mechanical ventilation, and they have to agree with me based on kind of my conclusion on this. So the background of this and the title of this study is Adaptive Support Ventilation May Deliver Unwanted Respiratory Rate Tidal Volume Combinations in Patients with Acute Lung Injury, Ventilated According to the Open Lung Concept. So the background of this is basically adaptive support ventilation, respiratory rate, tidal volume are all functions of what's called the Otis least work of breathing formula. The authors of this study hypothesized that adaptive support ventilation, or ASV, in an open lung ventilator strategy would deliver higher tidal volumes to patients with acute lung injury. So essentially, if they set the ventilator up based on how the ventilator is going to adapt to the patients, they did some tests, bench tests, and I'll kind of highlight those. They hypothesized that instead of utilizing lower lung protective tidal volumes like we should be, especially in ARDS patients, and higher respiratory rates, they hypothesized that the patient would actually get the inverse, and they would get higher tidal volumes and low respiratory rates. So that's where this kind of study is I think, very, very important to kind of point out. Their methods, patients with acute lung injury were ventilated according to local guidelines, advising the use of 6 to 8 mils per kilo predicted body weight, or what's called ideal body weight. High concentrations of PEEP were applied, and recruitment maneuvers were also done. Remember, if you don't know what recruitment maneuvers are, or you don't know how to do those, look back a few episodes. I did a podcast specifically on recruitment maneuvers and identifying the maximum amount of recruitment we can get based on identifying plateau pressures, our static compliance, and then increasing our PEEP until we start seeing some changes. So check that podcast out. Continuing, ventilation parameters were recorded when the ventilator was switched to adaptive support ventilation and after recruitment maneuvers were completed. If tidal volumes increased to more than 8 mils per kilo, ideal body weight, airway pressure was limited to correct for the rise in tidal volume. So basically they did a stop point. They used a high pressure limit that would not allow, because we have to remember that the Hamilton T1 ventilator is a pressure driven ventilator. It is completely pressure. There is no volume mode of ventilation with the Hamilton T1. And that's one reason why you can't check a plateau pressure with a Hamilton T1. And that's kind of one of those misunderstood things is, I think they got a bad rap. They were kind of being labeled as, well, the ventilator is so sophisticated, why can't you check a plateau pressure? Well, we know plateau pressures cannot be checked in a pressure mode, only in a volume mode. And if this ventilator is 100% pressure, then that makes complete sense. So let's look at this. What the article tells us. Switching from pressure control ventilation, so that's what they started with, to an ASV in consecutive acute lung injury patients led to a decrease in respiratory rate and an increase in tidal volumes in patients with more compliant lungs. Adaptive support ventilation uses a microprocessor-controlled closed-loop mode of mechanical ventilation, provides automatic selection and continuous breath-by-breath adaptation of respiratory rate and tidal volume based on what it's identifying with pressures. With ASV, clinicians can neither set the respiratory rate or tidal volume because the delivered respiratory rate tidal volume combination is a function of that Otis least work of breathing formula. So that's kind of the problem, is that I think one of my big concerns initially was you're giving a fire department or an EMS agency with very little mechanical ventilation knowledge. We know that this is a big learning curve in the critical care environment, and that's why I've taken such a big stance on trying to improve our education. But now we're giving a ventilator, an ICU ventilator, that's phenomenal. I mean, I have to agree it is phenomenal, the things that it does. But we're just giving them that ventilator and we're saying, hey, just put them in ASV and your providers don't have to worry about it. And I think that's the problem. At 6 mils per kilo ideal body weight, as part of the lung protective ventilation was used, respiratory rate was set to maintain minute ventilation, ensuring a normal pH. The concentration of PEEP and FiO2 was set, ensuring a SpO2 of greater than 90% and a PaCO2 of more than 10. As part of the lung protective ventilation, recruitment maneuvers were frequently performed before every increase in PEEP and after every disconnection from the ventilator for suctioning. So what they did is they started out in a lung protective kind of mode of ventilation. They used pressure control ventilation, just standard pressure control ventilation. They utilized PEEP, FiO2, as it just said, and then they're going to compare that with patients put on ASV. Now, in the ASV aspect, basically you are going to establish an ideal body weight. You're going to put that ideal body weight in the ventilator. It then identifies, you place your PEEP in there, you place your FiO2 in there. PEEP and FiO2 in this circumstance were kept the same as with the pressure control ventilation setup. Target minute ventilation was set as the percentage leading to the same minute ventilation as we saw in the pressure control ventilation mode as I talked about previously. So essentially what they wanted to do is they want to simulate the exact same things and identify, an endpoint. The initial airway pressures were set at 60 centimeters of water to allow for ASV to reach the target minute ventilation. According to the software, this initial pressure will lead to a maximum plateau pressure of 50 centimeters of water. Now, I don't know about you, but we know based on past studies, many past studies, and I think that industry standard is 30 centimeters of water. That's where we don't want to exceed, is 30 centimeters of water. We know based on the new study that was released, and I did a podcast on driving pressure, that maybe plateau pressure is not the kind of go-to number to look at, that maybe driving pressures, especially in these ARDS patients, keeping them less than 15 is more of a determination of overall lung injury and inflammatory response, overall morbidity and mortality. In this study, basically what they did is they performed recruitment maneuvers to be certain that the lungs of the studied patients were maximally recruited during the observation. So they wanted to make sure that the functional residual capacity, the maximum amount of recruitment was applied so that they had a good, consistent evaluation based on both pressure control ventilation and ASV. In cases where tidal volume was more than 8 mils per kilo, ideal body weight with ASV. So basically what they're saying is if it ever reached greater than 8 mils per kilo, they set that pressure limit alarm, and the pressure limit alarm was decreased to the original pressure control plateau pressure plus 10 centimeters of water, creating a target plateau pressure that was similar to the plateau pressure applied with pressure control ventilation. So remember, when you're setting up pressure control ventilation, whatever your inspiratory pressure is plus your PEEP. Most ventilators now, and I've talked about this, are additive. So they're whatever it is above PEEP. If we have a pressure control inspiratory pressure of 25 and a PEEP of 10, your plateau pressure essentially is 35. So that's kind of what they're saying. So what were the results? Basically, the results ended up being pretty significant. They all basically had an adverse kind of effect. Plateau pressures increased when the ventilator was switched from pressure control ventilation to ASV immediately. There was a 6 centimeter water difference. Differences in plateau pressure with ASV before and after recruitment maneuvers were not statistically significant. So the results of this observational study can be summarized as follows. Respiratory rate decreases and tidal volume increases when switching from pressure control ventilation to ASV in patients with acute lung injury, ventilating according to that open lung concept, or that Otis least worker breathing. In patients with less compliant or more injured lungs, ASV maintains tidal volumes of less than 8 mils per kilo. In patients with more compliant lungs, i.e. less injured lungs, ASV delivers tidal volumes more than 8 mils per kilo. Pressure limitation on ASV can correct for this change, but leads to an unacceptable decrease in minute ventilation. So that's the key thing, and that's the thing that I have heard. I know that there's actually been some adverse events, and I'm not going to get into them, but adverse events based on exactly that. We got to remember, this is an algorithm. This is a machine. And if it's trying to adjust, and let's say your sedation is very poor, and we're trying to target, or the ventilator is trying to target a minute ventilation over 1 minute. And let's say the patient takes 2 large breaths, right? Because they're in SIMV, the patient takes 2 large breaths, we'll say 700 mils each. They cough a few times. Basically, the ventilator recognizes those as part of that minute ventilation, so it subtracts that. And it then is going to start adjusting the ventilator. And so it's very, very easy to, maybe the ventilator, as this study kind of represents, really increases the tidal volume and lowers the respiratory rate, because I believe, and I'll have to look at this, but I'm pretty positive that it will never sacrifice tidal volume. It will always sacrifice respiratory rate. And that's one of the things with this mode. It's always going to deliver a tidal volume. It may only deliver that tidal volume 4 times a minute. So we have to remember that the ventilator is just a machine. In comparison, pressure control ventilation with ASV, when we compare those two, volume-controlled ventilation was used in the ARGNET trial. And we know that the ARGNET trial, and we talked about this in the past few podcasts, is kind of that groundbreaking trial in 2000. And it's recommended use of the 6 mils per kilo. However, we explicitly chose to observe changes from pressure controlled ventilation to ASV and vice versa, because ASV is a pressure controlled mode of ventilation. So what they're saying is the ARSNet study used specifically volume controlled ventilation. They weren't going to completely follow the ARSNet kind of outlook on this, because this study, they wanted to closely represent pressure control versus ASV, which is also a pressure control mode. A subsequent analysis of the landmark study by the ARSNet showed the beneficial effect of tidal volume reduction to be independent of the severity of acute lung injury. So patients with less severe acute lung injury or less severe injured lungs also benefited from lung protective mechanical ventilation using those lower tidal volumes. And I illustrated that in the past podcast where I talked about the study where is 6 mils per kilo good for all patients. Lots and lots and lots of data showing that the inflammatory response, the negative response of higher tidal volumes, it sometimes takes a little bit of time to identify. So should we be prophylactically treating patients just to make sure that doesn't happen? Patients with less severe acute lung injury also benefited from the lung protective mechanical ventilation, as I just said, using decreased tidal volumes. In light of these findings, it is imperative to use tidal volumes close to 6 mils per kilo. ASV is capable of keeping tidal volumes within that desired range. We have to remember that, but we have to then adjust our pressure limit to account for that, and that's going to then, based on this study, it's going to limit your ability to deliver a minute ventilation. Our data shows that ASV applies larger tidal volumes when lungs are subjected to higher concentrations of PEEP and recruitment maneuvers. Results from 2 recent investigations, which evaluated ASV as a mechanical ventilation strategy in acute lung injury and ARDS, seem to be in contrast to our findings. And I want you to, I'll put this in the show notes with these highlighted areas that I've kind of hit on, so you can read this for yourselves. The performance of ASV in a simulated lung injury model and compared the ability of ASV to maintain plateau pressures below a set target of 28 centimeters of water. So that's below that 30 that we always kind of target, in comparison with fixed tidal volumes of 6 mils per kilo during controlled mechanical ventilation. It should be noted that minute ventilation was sacrificed when respiratory rate and tidal volume reached predefined limits. So I've hit this 1,000 times, guys. There are 2 things that are extremely important in mechanical ventilation. The first thing is you've got to hit the minute ventilation. We've got to understand that. We've got to target a minute ventilation. We have to account for dead space. We have to understand the difference between a targeted minute ventilation and alveolar minute ventilation. You can't have gas exchange without minute ventilation. On a healthy person, you give them a benzo, or you give them an opiate, or you think about just a healthy person having a heroin overdose. They become apneic. They breathe now 1 or 2 times a minute. They're going to become hypoxic. We got to remember that minute ventilation is a byproduct of, or basically illustrates ventilation. But if you're not having gas exchange, if you're not moving air through the alveolar membrane, then your patients are going to get into trouble very, very quickly. The second thing is we have to watch that plateau pressure. And I think the evidence has shown that driving pressure is much more important in the ARDS patient, but that is just that patient ARDS. Plateau pressure encompasses everybody else. And so those are the 2 big things. And ASV doesn't really, it really doesn't take that into consideration. And that's kind of one of my other issues. In a bench-to-bench study, we recently showed that ASV delivers high respiratory rates and low tidal volumes in a setting mimicking acute lung injury when the compliance of the test lung increased, right? So the compliance improved, respiratory rate decreased, and tidal volume increased. Delivered tidal volumes were not more than 8 mils per kilo ideal body weight when compliance of the test lung was set at a concentration that are achieved when using an open lung concept for acute lung injury. In conclusion, we found ASV to deliver possible unsafe respiratory rate and tidal volume combinations in patients with acute lung injury, ventilating according to an open lung concept. Pressure limitation did not correct for the unwanted increase in tidal volume, but it led to an unwanted decline in minute ventilation. Again, I just highlighted a lot of points. I want you to read this study. I want you to kind of research this on your own. If you're using the Hamilton T1, again, I think it's a phenomenal vent. I think it's got lots of amazing capabilities. I mean, I have to say, we had them side by side in a vent course. We put patients on the Revell, and we put them in non-invasive BiPAP, and we moved them over to the Hamilton T1 and put them on the same exact settings. And I can tell you that every person we did that to said that the Hamilton was much more comfortable, very smooth. It was a lot more quiet. It doesn't use as much gas. It's got a bias flow that's only 3 liters per minute. So there's a lot of amazing things the Hamilton T1 does. And I'm not slamming that ventilator. I think the ventilator is truly amazing. I really do. I guess I'm in complete disagreement of saying that ASV is the end-all be-all, and that basically you hand a provider, a clinician, the ventilator, and that they just put a patient in ASV and not worry about it. And that is a big problem waiting to happen. And I know that there's been adverse effects. There's been patient deaths. We'll just say that, based on this whole aspect of not watching the ventilator and having a minute ventilation basically drop to a point where you're not ventilating your patient. Now, you give this ventilator to somebody that understands mechanical ventilation, and they're not relying on that ASV to make all the decisions, and they're understanding what they're seeing, and they can identify, all right, we have maybe a drop in respiratory rate and an increase in tidal volume. All right, I need to make a change. Then I think it's fine. But I think we can't just make a blanket statement and say, hey, use this mode and you're good to go. And I know I've been told this. I've been told this by my fire department. There's a fire department that bought these Hamilton T1s, and that's kind of what they were led to believe. Obviously wasn't there, but that was what they conveyed to me. And so that's a little alarming. I've talked to my good buddy, Sam Matta, that heads up the ECHO conference and that whole initiative. And we talked about this specifically. And he agrees, you can't just give somebody a ventilator and expect the ventilator to do everything for you. So I think we need to study this more. I would love your feedback on this. If you use a Hamilton T1, email me or post your comments on Facebook or Twitter. I want to kind of pick your brain and hear your experiences. And if you have any ideas for upcoming podcasts, just please let me know. Email me at eric.bauer@FlightBridgeED.com. And if you have any other questions or comments, please forward those to me and I will answer them within 24 hours. Again, thank you for joining me, and I'll talk to you soon.
This has been a production of the FlightBridgeED Podcast, leading the way in pre-hospital critical care and emergency medicine education.